Hey humans, how's it going? Susan Ruth here. It's another episode of Hey Human Podcast. In this episode, I get to talk with my friend, actually. Yes, he's my friend. I have one or two here and there. Mark Carson. He is a historian, a professor of history, to be exact. And I like to be exact. His specialty is the Vietnam War. I don't know why I said Vietnam. I don't think that the enunciation is on that syllable, but it's okay, it's late, and I don't care. Vietnam, there, anyway. So Mark Carson, brilliant guy. He's also a songwriter, so that's pretty cool. And we sat at a house I was house sitting at, my friend Ellen's house, and we discussed the Vietnam War, and we discussed politics in general, then and now. I've titled this episode Fear and Loathing in Politics, if that gives you any kind of idea. It's a little shout out to Mr. Hunter S. Thompson, who is awesome. If you don't know who Hunter S. Thompson is, I suggest strongly that you go check out his oeuvre of books. He's a great writer. It's quite the journey to dig into one of his books. Start with Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, because there's nothing more depraved than a man on ether. But I digress. Okay, so Mark and I chattered along about the Vietnam War and this and that. And as I was saying, I was house sitting at my friend Ellen's house, and her dog Mabel, who is a lovely dog, but very noisy, she's very present in the first 10 minutes of the podcast, so just bear with. And then I tucked her away in a back room for the remainder of the episode. And so anyway, just wanted to point that out. The slurping you hear is Mabel the dog. She slurps loudly. What else was I going to say? If you haven't yet subscribed to Hey Human, please do so. You can do that on iTunes. And if you don't do the iTunes situation, you can hear the Hey Human podcast at, strangely, heyhumanpodcast.com. I was super duper creative with the title there. So heyhumanpodcast.com, Hey Human on iTunes. And as always, I put links about what we talked about on the heyhumanpodcast.com website. And so that's pretty cool. Mark talks about some books that I put up links for and that kind of thing. So without further ado, Mr. Mark Carson, no, not Mr., Dr. Mark Carson. Here we go. Hello, Mark.
Hello.
How are
Susan,
you?
how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, so explain what you do
What
and
do
who you are.
Well, I am a professor of history. My emphasis is on the Vietnam War, particularly the political aspects of the Vietnam War, because I've done a lot of research about Southern congressmen at the time, Southern members of Congress, senators, representatives, and stuff like that.
And Southern congressmen were more to do with the Vietnam War than any of the others.
Well, you do have a situation where a significant number of the Southern congressmen control Congress at this time, because they were from these districts and they kept getting reelected and stuff like that, and they tended to gravitate towards the military committees, the armed services committees, and stuff like that. So you do have a whole, and of course the Southerners in general being a little bit more militaristic, a little bit more brought up on guns and all that kind of stuff. And
it's always been that way.
It has always been that way. So you do have significant figures, on that side of the divide, basically the hawks, who were pushing for, more and more build-up of military over time. But the thing that I found interesting, that even though you do have an overwhelming support for Vietnam, overwhelming support for doing more to kind of destroy the communism in Vietnam, on the other side, you do have some of the foremost doves in Congress being from the South. William Fulbright of Arkansas, Albert Gore of Tennessee, A number of these people, Fulbright actually started holding Vietnam hearings in 1966, which is relatively early. The Vietnam protests, even smaller ones, started in 65, but it didn't really get started going until 67, 68.
What year did we enter Vietnam?
Good question.
Is that not sure kind of answer?
Well, no, if you want to talk about massive numbers of troops, that's late 64, 65. But if you want to talk about when we first started getting involved in Vietnam, you have to go back to 1945.
Really?
And even before that.
Fascinating.
Because you have Ho Chi Minh, who had been a nationalist, and he was a communist, but he had been a nationalist and trying to basically separate, or at least allow his country to become independent from, at the time it was French Indochina. During World War II, he would help downed American pilots over China. And what would happen was he would go into China, which is next door, and he would help rescue these downed pilots.
Ho Chi Minh did.
Ho Chi Minh.
They didn't talk about that much in history class.
And you had that, you had him helping some of these American pilots. And of course, at this time, French Indochina is being occupied by the Japanese. And the French is still there with the administration, the kind of the Vichy kind of collaborationist regime. So you have Ho Chi Minh rescuing these downed pilots. In return, the Americans helped train Ho Chi Minh's forces.
Gee, what an ironic twist.
Yeah. So you have the OSS, which is the forerunner to the CIA, helping train Ho's forces, and it was actually a point at which Ho got sick and he was near death, and the Americans helped
bring it back to health.
Bring back to health.
Do you think that Ho Chi Minh's girlfriends wore T-shirts that said "Ho's"?
Yes.
Is that documented?
Yes, that is. Yeah, it was a big documentary. Hose up for Hose.
Anyway, go on.
So this is this kind of podcast.
It's an everything.
And so what occurred was in 1945, when the war was over, and with Ho's help, the Allies expelled the Japanese from French Indochina. Mm-hmm. Ho Chi Minh declared independence using words from the Declaration of Independence. They had Americans on the podium as he was declaring independence, and it is said that there are...
Sorry, hold on for a second.
It's all right.
Let's get... Mabel is drinking deeply from... I'm house sitting right now, and so Mabel the dog, who is a giant... Well, she's got to be part... I don't know. She looks black and tan, and... Anyway, she just drank a lot of water. Thanks, Mabes. Good to see you, girl.
Yeah.
She's not sure what to make. Anyway, sorry. Didn't interrupt.
So, no... on the podium, when he said we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, apparently there was a flyover of American jets.
Whoa!
Yeah, that's what it was probably by accident, but so you have Americans on the podium, you have a Vietnamese leader declaring independence, using the words of the Declaration of Independence.
Why do we not know about this?
I
mean, I know you know about this, but I recall in history class hearing nothing of this. I mean, granted, I was a little stoned most of the time.
The problem is, in high school history classes, which I've taught, if you're teaching the entirety of American history, by the time the semester's over, you barely scratch the surface on Vietnam or anything else.
Yeah.
And this is not really a knock against. I mean, and there are very reputable schools that teach history.
Sure.
But history is often thought of as an afterthought. And, you have the high school wrestling coach teaching history, and that they might not necessarily be bad teachers. But that's not their emphasis, and so you often kids often get rather short shrift on these types of issues because they don't know about them, they didn't read enough about them, they read enough of the textbook or something like that. They didn't actually do research to be able to find out. But I mean, if you read kind of there's a America's Longest War, which is now a title that isn't actually true because America's Longest War was in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
But America's
Again,
Longest
a
War.
good example of us providing weaponry and
Right.
training, and then going, "Just kidding, guys.
Right.
We're coming for you."
But you know how you had America's Longest War by George Herring, who's one of the kind of the deans of historians on Vietnam. He writes kind of the textbook on Vietnam.
Uh-huh.
That's one of the first things they talk about.
Yeah.
So it's readily available. It's just it's not really discussed as much. It really wasn't discussed as much.
Right.
But Americans, for the longest time, supported.
I'm so sorry.
That's all right.
I'm going to stop for a second. Okay. Sorry about that little interlude there.
That's all right. I can't remember where we were.
I think we were talking about so the flyby. Itchy armpit. The flyby of
Right, yeah. Well, I see Americans actually supported Ho Chi Minh because he was the one that helped them during the war, and it was actually really common knowledge, or at least if they looked hard enough to they would know that Ho Chi Minh had been a communist for a long time. He was actually at the Versailles negotiations in 1919 in France.
Did they just pretend like they didn't know, or they really didn't?
Well, they needed his help. They needed his help
that's
to
the
help
bottom
fight
line.
the Japanese.
Yeah.
Okay, in Indochina. So they got out of there. But then you have between 45 and 47, you have the kind of buildup of animosity between the Soviets and the United States, and you have the Cold War beginning. That was when his communism started to at least they started to talk more about his communism, and they're like, okay, well, we can't really support him because he's communist. And the French, there's other parts of it that I left out, which are very important actually. They would all these negotiations about what would happen with Indochina. The French wanted it back, and initially Roosevelt said no. They've been subjugating these people for a long time.
The French.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't get it back, and then of course Roosevelt died, Truman coming in, very new to all this stuff. Churchill made a significant play to bring the French back in, because basically if they took the French out of the colonies in Asia, what's going to happen with the British? So he's very much a colonialist anyway, and so you had, with American help, the French being brought back in. At the same time, you have I'm talking about Ho being a communist. Ho Chi Minh actually sent a few letters to Truman around that time, saying that I'll help if you help me. Basically, the Americans helping the French come back into Indochina.
Now, why did the Americans want France to do that? Just because now suddenly the French are going to be our allies for the next
Well,
war?
you also have it gets very complicated, because the Americans wanted to set up. They were in the process of trying to set up something like NATO, which eventually became NATO, and so they wanted. And you have to understand, the Soviets were moving into Eastern Germany, and there was a fear that they would start moving into the western part of Germany too. France's economy was all screwed up after the war and all that kind of stuff, and so they wanted to support France, and France kind of blackmailed them, basically saying,
Blackmailed whom?
Blackmailed the United States,
okay. Mm-hmm.
saying if you want us to remain non-communist, if you want us to remain viable, we're going to need a colony in Indochina. And so between the negotiations of that, between Churchill insisting that all these European countries needed to get their Asian colonies back and all that kind of stuff, the Americans aided the French into getting back into Indochina.
Whoa.
So you have that. So
this is what happens when you give children the game Risk. They grow up and they...
all my professors have brought that up, yes.
For real.
So yeah, no, I mean, so anyway, and of course, Ho Chi Minh resisted this. So you have...
I imagine he did.
Yes, so you had the French Indochina War that went between 1946 and 1954. And in the end, you have a mechanized army against Ho Chi Minh's forces that didn't have very many supplies. They started to get some supplies from the Soviets, but at that point, not so much. But as it went on, you have the Soviets starting to supply and getting some stuff from China as well, Communist China as well, started to supply Ho Chi Minh. But the Americans started to basically foot the bill for this war because the Americans wanted France for NATO. The Americans wanted France to be a viable country, and every time they had these negotiations, France kept saying, well, in order for us to be viable, we need to have our colony, so you need to help us. So by 1954, America was funding the French side of the French Indochina War about 75% of the...
Why did America give a crap's ass that any other country was communist? Why did they care?
Well, because you do have... honestly, there is a very real threat from the Soviet Union.
At this point.
At this point. Because, you had the war was just over, and you have both... At the end of the war, both the Western democracies and the Western democracies on the West and the Soviet Union from the East all descending upon Germany. All of the countries that the Soviet Union liberated from communism, from Hitler, became communist.
And so, I'll save you if you become a communist.
Yeah, by force usually.
Yeah.
And so the Americans and the French and the British were concerned that the Soviet Union wouldn't stop with Eastern Europe and would start to move into Western parts.
So Russia comes in and says, we'll save you from this jackass Hitler, but we do it by being a jackass ourselves. So they basically went from the frying pan to the fire.
For the most part, yeah. A lot of those Eastern European countries, got liberated from Hitler, and a few years later became part of the Warsaw Pact. Became part of it. And a lot of times it was because the Soviet troops wouldn't leave. They wouldn't, they kept them there. So you have that happening, and so there's a very real concern that communism would be spread, and then you have, the whole beginnings I could go into the whole beginnings of the Cold War, but there is a real concern that the Soviet Union was expanding into as many places as they could, and in fact they were trying to expand into a lot of different places. And the part of the whole kind of doctrine of communism is kind of the fomenting of world revolutions. But not all of it was directed from the Soviet Union. You have Ho Chi Minh being a communist, but a complex character, a significant nationalist, wanting to nationalize, wanting his country to be independent, and he'd been wanting that since the 19
Explain, the difference between a nationalist and a communist.
Okay.
And a socialist, those laws were there.
Well, if somebody's a nationalist, somebody wants, especially with regards to Vietnam, and you can go back even further with Vietnam. Vietnam has been under the yoke of foreigners for thousands of years, literally. China for about 1,000 years. And at every point, and sometimes it took them forever, but the Vietnamese always threw out the foreigners. Always. They threw out China was there for nearly 1,000 years. They threw them out. The French were there, and eventually they threw them out in 1954. So you do have Ho Chi Minh as being this person who was fighting for his people, basically saying, "We don't want the foreigners to govern us. We want to govern ourselves." Now, mixed with that is his belief in communism. So if the government that was going to result from what he was doing was communist, but not necessarily 100% tied to the Soviet Union. In fact, the Soviet Union and Ho Chi Minh, Ho was playing the Chinese and the Soviets, who had this kind of rivalry going on, against each other, so we can get the most things. And so basically, the Soviets were supporting but not controlling what was going on.
Yeah.
So he was Ho Chi Minh. Yeah, Ho Chi Minh was basically someone who wanted the independence of Vietnam. In 1945, if the United States had gone in and helped Ho Chi Minh and tried to block the French, you'd have Vietnam being communist, but not necessarily aligned with the Soviet bloc.
Okay.
And so you have that, and that's that's the whole thing. But they saw it all through the lens of fighting communism because of the threat of the Soviets in particular.
Sure.
So they basically thought that Ho was a puppet of, the Soviets or the Chinese or both of them. And all this is going on with a lot of the drama going on when all of Eastern Europe is becoming communist. And so they see it all through the whole idea of containment, which was Americans. The Americans.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's okay. It starts getting confusing.
I know it is. But I mean, the Americans saw Vietnam through the lens of this whole kind of anti-communist struggle. So their fight to keep communism contained in Asia was the same to them as keeping communism contained in Europe, and they were all going on at the same time.
So was that just sort of? I mean, was America really, really concerned that America was going to go communism? I know there sure is tons of rhetoric of fear, but that's always used in politics.
Well,
but in reality, that's just a fear-mongering technique, right?
Well, you see, in part it was fear, in part it was based on a real concern,
because they didn't want Russia to get more and more land and more power.
Yes. And they didn't know where they were going to stop.
Yeah. Okay.
But you also have let's go to the basic. What's generally thought of as the beginning of the American involvement in the Cold War. You have Greece and Turkey. Greece and Turkey had some left-wing revolutions going on in 1946-47. Okay, they were Britain was usually the protector of Greece and Turkey, but Britain was basically bankrupt at the time.
Sure.
So they asked the United States to come in and help, especially since there were these revolutions that were going on, or at least the beginnings of these revolutions or stirrings going on, and left-leaning, so they thought it might be communist. So Truman decided they wanted to do this, but he needed to convince the American people to do it. He started talking to members of Congress, and his Secretary of State started talking to members of Congress and all that kind of stuff. And one member of Congress from the South basically said the only way that you're going to get the Americans to go to back giving aid to Greece and Turkey is to scare the hell out of the American people. And it's literally what he said. And so they wrote a speech, and he delivered this speech. Truman delivered this speech before a joint session of Congress and on radio, basically saying that America had to choose between two ways of life, between freedom or communism, for the most part.
Wow. And now that rhetoric is freedom and terrorism, of course.
Yeah. And so you have Truman actually going well beyond. He didn't really want to scare them as much as he did, but he did. But then, of course, you have that going on. You have the loss of China in 1949. So you have everybody saying, "Okay, China's now gone. There must be communists in our midst." And then you have the whole McCarthyism thing. So it started to build upon itself. Meanwhile, you have the whole French Indochina War going on. And so that's thought of as the struggle between the French and the communists. As opposed to
that fed into the rhetoric.
Yeah, as opposed to the French who were colonial oppressors, and the nationalist forces of Ho Chi Minh who happened to be communists. See? Yeah. So that America wanted to contain communism as much, and it's all part of the whole containment strategy. But the strategy wasn't significantly as well. And they had an original framework to try to base. Okay, we're going to contain communism where it appears, and they had other types of National Security Council documents and stuff like that tried to guide it. But it became a bit myopic because we started to get involved in almost everywhere and started to spread ourselves thin. And in the case of Vietnam, we really kind of misjudged who we were dealing with. Not that America ever lost any battles in any of the Vietnam War, but it didn't matter. It's the same. There's lots of parallels between the Vietnam War and the American Revolution. The Americans actually did win some battles, but the Americans basically lasted as long as they could, and eventually the British got tired.
And that's exactly what happened in Vietnam.
Really?
Yeah. The American...
We lost a lot of lives in Vietnam, did we?
We lost a lot of lives in Vietnam. We never lost any of the battles.
Really?
Yeah. And what was interesting is Vo Nguyen Giap, who was the main general, the main Vietnamese general, was talking to American officials near the end of the war. One of the military officials was talking to Giap and said, basically, I want you to understand that we never lost any of the battles in this war. And then Giap said, that's very true. It's also irrelevant. Because basically, eventually the Viet Cong forces and the North Vietnamese forces didn't have to win. They just had to outlast the Americans and wait for the Americans to get tired of what was going on and pull out, which is what they did.
Which is what they did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
so we pull out of Vietnam, which to the delight of many Americans, the hippie side, I suppose, right?
Yes. Well, by the time we were pulling out, there were like 71% of Americans who thought it had been a mistake to go in.
Yeah.
So it had pretty much turned around.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
as war often, when people start losing their own sons and daughters, I think that, although I guess daughters probably weren't as many daughters at that point.
You did have some nurses. You
did
have some nurses who were involved.
But not like now.
No, it's not. No, it didn't have the significant presence in the military of women that they do now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I mean, it's interesting. I mean, and it's so much different now because the people that are fighting the wars now are only a small percentage of the population, and also, they're volunteer. Before you had the draft, and so you had maybe widespread people protesting when it looked like America was going to lose the war, or there's so many body bags coming back and stuff like that. Now you have a kind of a volunteer army.
Yeah.
So most Americans' families are experiencing only those families that are military families that actually have volunteered to do this.
Yeah.
So it's quite different now.
Yeah. I don't think it lessens the blow.
No, not at all. But I mean, what I'm saying, as far as like massive protests against a military involvement.
I also think that we unfortunately are quite lazy and have other things that interest us, like video games and iPhones. And, I mean, it's sad to say,
true.
But I think it's true. Technology has basically created a more zombie. There's always jokes about, be prepared for the zombie apocalypse.
Right.
And I think, wait, aren't we in the zombie apocalypse right now? Did I miss something?
I totally get it. I mean, there's always been this kind of simplistic attitude towards anything in American foreign policy. There's always been this kind of simplistic, we're going to go get the bad guys and all that kind of stuff, where the realities are a lot more complex. And it's just, as people, when you have an electorate that is significantly not educated on
foreign
policy in particular, then you don't, how are they going to choose people who are savvy at this kind of stuff, who are...
Well, I think politicians rely on the fact that most Americans don't do anything except for what they're fed.
They certainly do. They all, a significant number of politicians. Well, I mean, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Donald Trump is basically knows very little about foreign policy, very little about American history, very little about any of that. It's basically, okay, I'm going to fix it. I'm going to find...
but he quotes statistics that are completely erroneous.
Yeah, I'm going to find some people who are going to do the job for me.
Yeah, he'll hire them out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The only problem, well, there's many problems, but one of the main problems is if you have an orator. I mean, I think this is where he gets his comparisons to Hitler sometimes, is that, although I think Hitler was actually quite a bright man.
He was significantly.
Yeah, I think he was up there on the scale. I wouldn't. Anyway, that being said, when you are speaking to a populace and you are intentionally misrepresenting, misquoting, misdirecting, I don't understand how that's not a crime, first of all. I know it's free speech, but it's not free speech when it incites riot.
Yes, but you see...
There's a fine line between free speech and inciting riots.
Riot, yeah. You
can't, and calling for murder, I mean, they've thrown out, put Hillary in front of a fire line. Regardless of your politic, left or right, that's inappropriate.
Yeah. And... the thing about conventions, the whole conventions, you're always going to have the crazies out there.
I know.
On both sides.
It's incredible theater.
It is actually just theater, and since there's now no kind of drama, because usually since, I don't know, 76, there was actually some sort of drama with regards to who was going to be the nominee on the Republican side, because it was between Nixon and Ford. But basically, you don't have any drama, so it's basically an infomercial. It's a commercial for the for the party.
Yeah.
So all the people, all the crazies come out, to be on television, to wave their banners, to dance around.
But you and I are bright. We understand this, and I'm not dissing people that aren't bright. I'm just saying that it's very manipulative of people that don't know better, and it's. To me, that's completely the antithesis of what America, in quotes, should stand for.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think. But it's not to me, it's not a new problem.
It's not. I know.
Maybe it's a worse problem now. But
I don't think it's any worse. I think it's just better televised. Yeah. I think people are the same as they've always been, and we're very young.
I think the great difference, though. I mean, you have somebody like Richard Nixon was talking about law and order. Richard Nixon was talking about various things. He had a secret plan to end the war, which he ended up not having. Nixon knew he was lying. I don't often think that Donald Trump tells so many lies. I think that at the point of when he speaks, and I've read a lot about this, at the point of when he speaks, he actually believes whatever it is he's saying, even if later he's going to contradict himself.
Well, that's the best way to lie, isn't it?
Yeah.
To actually believe what you're saying.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a tactical...
I mean, even going back to Hitler, somebody like Hitler talked about the big lie. You keep saying it over and over again and people will believe it.
Absolutely.
But he knew it was a lie.
Yeah.
I think Donald Trump is so megalomaniacal that he
Say
thinks...
that 5 times really fast.
I know. That he actually, at the point he is saying something, he believes it.
Yeah.
So he's able to convince everyone. And then 10 minutes later, it's like, because it's all about him. It's all about the feeling.
It's all about the moment. I joke with some of my friends that that he's on the payroll of the Democrats because, they're like, we'll give you like $10 million to just be as insane as humanly possible,
Well, it's
or maybe Gates paid him to bring down the system or something.
What was funny is that it's not a great movie, but it's a great premise. I thought there was a movie Bulworth that was.
I loved that movie. Did you know Warren Beatty wrote that movie?
Yeah.
Oh God, what an incredible movie!
It is a good movie. I've seen it enough time. I used to play it for my government classes, and they totally missed the point because it was too much about race and sex and everything else, and that was just and drugs
and Halle Berry.
So
it is a very good.
But movie. It was basically about campaign finance reform, which the whole thing was about about the too much money in politics. But the point I was making is like Bulworth started out by saying, okay, look, so I'm disillusioned with the whole thing, so I might as well tell the truth. So he keeps telling the truth, and the more outrageous he gets, the more people start to hone in on him. Now that sounds very familiar to me with the Trump campaign, because Trump had no clue that he was going to get this far.
I know.
He had no idea.
You can kind of see it in his eyes when he's talking.
Yeah, it's like... with Trump, everything is a competition, and if he wins, it makes him stronger. It was that with women. He always talks about all the women he's had. He talks about business. Sure. It's all about the competition, and it's all about that. And so he started out by saying, okay, what if I say some crazy shit? What if it does happen to be what he believes about,
Is it though? Sometimes I wonder.
Well, I've heard, there's so much that go on in the campaign, don't know what's true, but I heard Jon Stewart say the other night, they were quoting from things that Trump said over the years.
Okay.
One of the things that Trump said, that at one point he said, I have black people counting my money right now, and I'm not really comfortable with that.
I remember that.
I'd rather have people counting my money that wear yarmulkes all day.
Yeah, the Jews.
Yeah.
Right, I remember he
so
said
it's like,
that. Yeah.
So, and honestly...
But he's like the blowhard drunk guy at a party in the Hamptons. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
That's what he reminds me of. The guy that's sort of walking around, spilling his liquor a little bit, grabbing the ass of the hot chick that walks by, and he's like, "Oh, I've got this great joke about a Jew and a priest and a blah." He's like that guy.
He is that guy, but without the being drunk off his ass. Well, of course, I'm sure he was drunk off his ass a bunch of times at those parties, but he came from privilege. He was that, overserved, overprivileged guy.
Yeah, which is weird because the anti-Hillary people scream about how she comes from privilege. It's just this weird myopic thing that happens in politics that it's like, let me just take my brain out and then I can pick a side.
Well, see, to me, the most insidious thing about American politics is basically, and I don't think this election is going to come down to that, but it may. It's getting closer now. You have at least a year's worth of television and radio and every other type of media basically just pouring on what's going on in the campaign. You hear all these snippets and stuff like that. People in the battleground states especially see these commercials all the time coming on about one side or another and all that kind of stuff. And eventually, in a lot of American elections, it comes down to 1 to 2% of the people who have heard all this stuff and still have not made up their minds. Yet they still bother to vote. In 2004, I remember, and it looked like George W. Bush was going to lose because he was about 40-something%, and it looked like Kerry was, who was a terrible candidate, looked like he was gaining, or it looked like he was, and I remember having lunch with friends of mine saying, okay, wow, I wonder what a Kerry administration is going to be like. Then I started, when I was driving somewhere that morning of election day, the heads, or at least the afternoon, they were talking about some exit polling, or at least they were talking about what people were saying. And I kind of thought that Kerry was in trouble when I heard some of the answers of this exit poll. And one of the things that they said that some people said that because they didn't vote for Kerry because he was too rich.
Interesting.
And George W. Bush is from oil.
Yeah,
from the
of
oil.
course.
And so it's all about perception. It's not necessarily about the reality of all of it. And so that's. And once again, and in that election, it was 51-49.
Yeah.
So it's to the 1 to 2%.
It scares me because a lot of people who I consider bright people are saying to me, I'm not going to vote because I have no choice. Which, man, it upsets me.
Yeah.
It does. It upsets me.
Well, the problem is,
I know everyone, it's an American right. You can take it or leave it, but there's something fundamental about that.
No, I agree. I mean, the problem is that the American political system has become this kind of popularity contest and based on hearsay and
but even the popular vote doesn't necessarily win, which is also confusing.
Yeah. Well, that's the Founding Fathers who, honestly, the Founding Fathers really, really distrusted the average American person, and that's why they made up this tortured logic of the Electoral College. They did not trust the people. Look at who these people were. Who were the Founding Fathers? They were these plantation owners. There were these merchants. There were these people. Nobody was poor. Nobody was middle class. All these people were the cream of the crop,
of course,
of America.
And bright, and
the brightest, the best and the brightest
They're
of America.
poets and writers and intellects,
but rich, significantly.
Sure.
And they, for the most part, wanted to put in protections against what they talk about, the problem of faction or the problem of an individual who might become a king or a dictator or all this kind of stuff. And so they were scared of the people. They were scared of the average people, so they put in something like the Electoral College, which is just a strange kind of system.
Yeah, it is.
Because now you have, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, maybe Iowa, and a few other states And you're not going to see, it's a 50-state election, but you're going to see the presidential candidates in 10 states most of the time. Mm-hmm. The rest of the states are just like, okay.
Whatever, yeah.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to me. All right, let's get back to Vietnam.
Okay.
It's so easy to talk about what's going on right now,
Okay.
but let's get back to Vietnam. So
All right.
I read it, and this is sort of not about politics. Well, maybe it is about politics. I read an article yesterday that said that 75%-ish of American forces fighting, like of the people actually doing the groundwork, were getting heroin supplied to them. Do you know anything about this?
Now?
Do you know anything about it? No. Back when they were fighting, they would be sent heroin and cigarettes and Playboys, or whatever.
They were being sent cigarettes and Playboys, and Bob Hope came down every now and then.
Yeah. I just wondered, get them hyped up so they could...
Drug use in Vietnam actually started to spike the latter years of what was the 70 through the 73, because they were pulling forces out. American forces out, so there was no real point to the war. Americans were continually dwindling, and it was really hard to fight a war when you had so few forces. They were trying to rely on the South Vietnamese, who were basically corrupt and incompetent, the armies, and so a lot of the frustration led to a significant spike in drug use. Now, were they being supplied heroin? I've never really heard that.
Okay.
But that's not to say that they hadn't been. You have to kind of put yourself in the mindset of the 60s, and when,
of course.
As far as, you have these problems, take these pills or whatever it is. But
Sure.
There was a lot of alcohol, there was a lot of weed, there was a lot of access, and especially, I think there was a significant, in certain parts of Vietnam, a significant growth of opium.
Yeah.
The poppy plants.
That makes sense.
So you do have a ready supply of opiates, some sort of drugs that soldiers could get access to.
I wasn't sure if it maybe was some sort
of idea. I don't think it was a part of. I've never read that there was actually part of a military program to give them that, to hype them up, to bring them in there.
Yeah.
Did a number of the soldiers?
Well, heroin, I think, is a downer, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm not enough of a drug person to know, but
sure.
you would think that they would give them some amphetamines or something like that to bring them, hype them up.
Interesting.
I'm not saying it didn't happen. I just don't know about it.
Take us through our stepping in and sort of the process of what happened, and then our disentanglement. And why? What? Okay.
So you have, to try to shorten it as much as possible, you have, the French losing at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, and eventually that was the beginnings of their leaving Indochina. So you have this conference, this Geneva conference going on, and there was Ho Chi Minh, and there were the Chinese, and there were a number of groups that were involved in this conference to try and figure out what they were gonna do. Now, Ho Chi Minh, of course, had won the war, and so he wanted independence for Vietnam. And the Americans kind of came in, but they didn't really participate. But they kind of moved behind the scenes and worked things. And China wanted to become a player on the international stage, so they didn't want to be too hard on the Europeans and everything else. And so what they came up with was this division of Vietnam, North and South. It was supposed to be temporary, 1954, and so 1956 there were supposed to be these national elections, Vietnam-wide elections, and they were going to choose a leader. And of course, it was obvious it was going to be Ho Chi Minh because he was the most popular figure. Well, in the meantime, and that was kind of helped, like behind the scenes, engineered, convinced China through, and Americans kind of helped have that. And of course, at that point, Americans created the nation of South Vietnam. They chose the leaders. They chose the leader. They gave them enormous amounts of money. In fact, in 1956, Senator John F. Kennedy was talking about South Vietnam being our child, our offspring.
And wait, did this because we...
Anti-communist.
Yeah, the communists.
Under the guise of communism. So we gave them all...
So North Korea now suddenly is the
Vietnam.
communist...
Yeah.
I mean, it's not Korea. I don't know why I said Korea. North Vietnam is now the communist side. South Vietnam
is the non-communist side. You notice I didn't say democracy.
Yeah.
They chose...
It's not a democracy. That would be a...
They under the guise of it being a democracy, they not only... propped up created the nation of South Vietnam. They chose the first leader, Diem, Ngo Diem, who was a Catholic in a country that was 85% Buddhist. He didn't wear traditional Vietnamese garb. He wore these white linen suits. He was westernized.
Yeah.
And he was not a believer in democracy. He was more kind of like a Chinese Mandarin, where to have his whole family was dealing with all kinds of stuff. Started persecuting people who, and so that's out of that became the southern Vietnamese intellectuals who did not like Diem created the National Liberation Front, which eventually became known as the Viet Cong. So they were tied a little bit to Ho Chi Minh, but they really wanted Diem out. So you have all that going on. And throughout the 50s, Americans propping up, they bring Diem to America, call him the George Washington of South Vietnam and all that kind of stuff, and all this under the guise of so basically after the French showed them the example of what would happen when you go against these the Vietnamese, and they failed miserably, the Americans thought they could do it better.
How American of them.
Yes, and what it's all about. There's a great book, Lauren Barrett's Backfire, starts talking about American culture and how we thought we could do it better. Our ingenuity was better, our technology is better, and all that kind of stuff. So we're going to be able to do it better. And after all, it was the French. Those are the attitudes. And so anyway, the Americans continually helped through Eisenhower's administration into Kennedy's administration, back Diem, and they saw all the horrible things that Diem was doing to his people, and they were like, you need to put in democratic reforms. And at every point, Diem was like, well, I can't do it when things are unstable here. I need more money, I need more troops, I need more supplies, I need more all this kind of stuff. And so the Americans didn't know what to do and didn't want to back out, because then they'd look like Chamberlain and Munich. And like basically appeasing the communists or whatever, just not
follow,
not being strong.
Yeah,
and it's a lot about manhood and stuff like that. That's all tied into that.
I'm actually surprised there's not a giant penis on the American flag. To be honest.
Yeah, it's America. Anyway, so Kennedy tries throughout his presidency to try and understand what's going on and stuff like that. And eventually, when you have the Buddhist burning himself in the middle of Saigon, the guy who immolated himself, the Buddhist monk who, got in the middle of the street in Saigon, poured gasoline over him and set himself on fire, and the whole international media is all taking pictures of all this stuff. Kennedy came to the conclusion that Diem should be out. So he basically gave word to the generals in South Vietnam that if they fomented a coup against Diem, that the Americans weren't going to stand in the way of that. So America chose created South Vietnam, chose a leader when the leader did things that didn't like, then help facilitate a coup. And when the coup occurred, they didn't do anything to stop it. And eventually, and of course, there was all these assurances that Diem would be saved and he would just go into exile. But then, when the coup happened, Diem and his brother were shot on the back of a Jeep.
Just can't rely on coolers.
Yeah, well, what was interesting is when Kennedy got the word, his face turned white. He didn't expect this to happen. And I don't understand how, because I was just saying, I've never seen him this shocked. It's like, okay. It's like, Kennedy's what's funny about Kennedy is they always talk about Kennedy saying, he wouldn't have got us into Vietnam. There were 1,000 American advisors in Vietnam when he was elected. There were 16,000 when he was assassinated. Would he have escalated it as much as Johnson did? Who knows? But he wasn't backing out. Anyway, so you have Johnson coming in, who's basically a domestic politician. He didn't know a whole lot about foreign policy, and so he was just following what the Kennedy advisors, McNamara and some of the others, were doing. And I've heard a lot of conversations, the phone conversations at the Johnson Presidential Library between him and advisors. And he was like, as early as 1964, he was saying, I have no idea how we're going to win. I don't really think we're going to win this thing. But
this is Johnson.
But we need to do something to maintain.
He was like crapping his pants.
Oh yeah, he just inherited this horrible situation. But he was like one of those guys. He didn't want to be Chamberlain at Munich. He didn't want to be thought of as an unmanly kind of man. He didn't want to be thought of as the first president to lose a war and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, he had this very ambitious domestic agenda, the whole Great Society programs. He knew that if he went all in on Vietnam, that he wouldn't be able to get the Great Society programs. So he did it incrementally. So he started, and every time there was, and of course the whole Gulf of Tonkin incident, half of which was they didn't even know, that actually probably didn't happen. He used that as a pretext to sign this Gulf of Tonkin resolution, basically saying that the Congress, he brought through Congress, basically saying that the Congress gave the president permission to go in and do whatever he needed to do. And so,
really quick, explain Gulf of Tonkin.
Gulf of Tonkin resolution.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, Gulf of Tonkin incident. You have American ships basically spying on North Vietnam. They were in North Vietnamese waters. That's not what they said at the time. They said they were in international waters. They weren't. It was all part of this plan that they were in North Vietnamese waters, trying to help out the South Vietnamese. So you had two American ships. There was one kind of confirmed attack between an American ship and some North Vietnamese gunboats. Nobody was hurt or anything like that. And then there was another attack the next day or the day afterwards, or at least supposed, but the weather was terrible, it was dark, radar was all messed up, probably nothing happened. So, very iffy situation at best, but Johnson was looking for a way to escalate the war. And so,
without looking like it's a bad guy.
Without looking like it's a bad guy. And so because they couldn't find a way to win this thing. And so, he was getting all kinds of advice. And so he decided to try to escalate the war. And so what he did was they had this Gulf of Tonkin resolution, basically saying that authorizing the president to use force to stabilize the situation in South Vietnam. I could go into the specifics, but it's basically, and so, he goes on television and said that America has been attacked while they were in neutral waters, or international waters.
Lying.
Yeah, he's basically misleading people.
And the people don't know.
And of course, the Congress lines up behind him. And William Fulbright, who eventually turned against him, was one of the big champions of the bill because he was a good friend of LBJ. So, and this is the thing he regrets for the rest of his life. He basically helps him steer this bill through the Senate because he was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. And so this whole thing gets passed very easily. And so gradually you have the increasing troops, you have Rolling Thunder, which is the bombing campaign that goes on in the north and in the south. And eventually by 66 into 67, 68, you have about 500,000 Americans
in Vietnam. Fighting the North.
Yeah, fighting not only the North, but the Southern Communists, the Viet Cong. So you have the North Vietnamese army on one side, helped by the Viet Cong, versus the Americans and the South Vietnamese army.
What a shit show.
Oh, it was total chaos.
Yeah.
And there were only a few advisors that were actually saying to Johnson, we need to rethink this. And he just ignored them. Or in fact, the vice president, Humphrey, mentioned something about it, and then he was not let into a lot of the meetings for a couple of years. Because Johnson, he was trying to hold all this together. He was trying to hold Vietnam together. He was trying to hold the domestic policy agenda that he had. That was what he called the woman I really loved. He wanted, but in order to do that, he had to go slow, and he had to kind of mislead on Vietnam.
Kind of?
Yeah. Well, yeah, mislead.
Yeah.
And
But I say this. I said this the other day, and going to present time again. Whenever it seems there's about to be an election, strangely the terror alert goes to orange. These are not coincidences.
No.
It's all a humongous pile of smoke and mirrors. It really, in order to get their agenda.
Perception is.
Have you seen Wag the Dog?
Yes.
That is a fantastic movie.
It's a great movie. And there's a lot of that happens. I'm not really a conspiracy theorist or anything like that, but there is some very
compelling evidence.
Compelling evidence that when someone, with regards to the terror alerts, that kind of stuff was in George W. Bush's presidency was done a significant amount.
Yeah.
Whenever there was something that
whenever his ratings went down.
Yeah, whenever his ratings, there's a terror alert, so he had to be.
Yeah.
There's always have been candidates and office holders
on both
in
sides.
The presidency on both sides
who
used fear to
look. That is
bring up
bottom line. Fear is the best manipulative tool.
Yeah.
Bottom line. It certainly isn't love, sadly.
Yeah.
It's absolutely fear. Fear and hate, xenophobia, homophobia, racism, just all of it. The whole thing.
Yeah.
It's a great, powerful tool of manipulation.
Yeah. So, and that's it's all that fear, and anti-communism. The whole Cold War era was. Yeah, there were some significant threats, but the fear was ratcheted up significantly, and the fear was used to do all kinds of things.
So you said a minute ago that we never lost a battle, and yet we lost a lot of lives. So where were we losing those lives?
Okay. Well, the way that the war was fought, they didn't know. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army would never really have these pitched battles. They would have these little hit and run things. They'd find out where the Americans were. They'd do these little raids. Then they disappear back into the jungle. So they weren't. They wanted to try to engage the enemy. The Americans wanted to try to engage the enemy in these kind of pitched battles, kind of more of a conventional type of war. But the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong wouldn't do that.
They wouldn't play fair.
Yeah, they would. But, so what the strategy became was search and destroy. So
hence Agent Orange?
You try, that's part of it, to clear away the jungles. But you try to find the enemy, you kill as many of them as you can, and if you have killed more than they've killed of you, then you're winning the war. So you have the Americans going through, like in Platoon, and like you've seen, going through these little villages and stuff like that, trying to ferret out where the Viet Cong were, where the NVA was.
Not unlike Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Not like
trying to find these people, and of course you have these 18, 19, 20-year-old kids coming in after just a small amount of training, coming in for a year, going in, not speaking, Vietnamese and all that kind of stuff, and
scared out of their wits. You have these people coming in trying to interrogate
members of these little hamlets and stuff like that. So a significant number of the people who were trying to do this didn't speak Vietnamese. So you have all this kind of stuff. So you have Americans going in and doing all that kind of stuff, and eventually a number of American troops dying from booby traps, from sniper fire, from all kinds of other things. When there was always, like say in the Tet Offensive, when the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong attacked in 100 places, by a couple of weeks they were devastated. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were devastated. every time that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong actually decided, okay, we're going to take it to them, this pitched battle, they lost. But America would lose a few here, a few there, in these little hamlets and these little villages. And so there was a lot of people dying, way more Vietnamese dying, in both North and South. So you have that many loss of life. I mean, we lost 58,000 people over, say, between 64 and 73.
Do you know the numbers for Afghanistan?
I don't know. But basically the Vietnamese lost 500,000, or even the numbers.
And continued to lose because of Agent Orange.
Yeah.
And so did we, though, right? The cancers.
That's true.
Yeah.
So what you have is, Americans lost a lot of lives, and a lot of it was because of the way they fought the war, and also it was because these guys were just stuck in the middle.
Which guys?
The American troops.
Yeah.
They were stuck. They were.
Well, yeah, I mean,
in a terribly confused situation.
Yes, literally fighting on every single angle.
Yeah. And you also have the way they did the enlistments was you serve for a year and then you're out.
If you lived that long.
Yeah, if you lived that long. But then think of that in terms of actually having an experienced military force.
Well, yeah,
once you get experienced and you actually make it through, you're gone.
Yeah.
And the new groups come in.
Yeah.
The officers often stay the same. The lifers and stuff like that. So it's not really an efficient way to run a war. You need these soldiers who actually have done it. And so from so many different angles, it was just a debacle.
Yeah.
But
it's interesting because now I have friends who are military, and they actually have people that know, they can kind of see the winds blowing. They're like, okay, we're going to need you to study North Korean. And then they take them and, they get immersed in the language for wherever the conflict's going to be in a couple of years.
Right.
They have that kind of foresight.
Yeah. Now. Now.
At least they learned a couple things.
Well, it's the funny part about it is when I teach this stuff, when you look at it, you think of the leaders, but the emphasis I have to make is that these leaders weren't stupid. They were maybe willfully ignorant of certain things. I mean, the State Department was coming up with all kinds of reports on before America got involved in Vietnam, on the history of Vietnam, on what was going on their penchant for kicking out the foreigner, about their patience in doing so and building up forces very slowly and eventually doing all that kind of stuff. And it was just willfully ignored because it was it didn't fit into
the ego of war.
But also their whole framework about communism.
Sure.
It's easier to put certain situations in a box rather than reading more and understanding actually what the individuals are talking about.
Yeah. And
there's also racism going on as well. American, surprise. Johnson saying we're here to help these little people, and stuff like that. So there is that.
That's what I like to call subtle racism.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was subtle for 1967 or something like that. Yeah, we're here to help you little people.
So how did the tides turn?
Okay, you have the Tet Offensive. Okay. For years, particularly the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, who was the architect of a significant amount of the military strategy, William Westmoreland, the general who was in charge of all the forces, American forces, had always been painting these bright pictures of what was going on in Vietnam. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel. We have the enemy on the run. All these kinds of things.
Meanwhile, there's protests.
Yeah, meanwhile, the protests are starting to mount up. And even actually, McNamara by 1967 was broken. He couldn't. He nearly had a nervous breakdown. He eventually gave somebody else the job. They gave him another job. He was head of the World Bank, and they put in Clark Clifford. But the point about it is, by early 1968, it had been suggested that America was getting close. America was going to be winning the war. It's hard to think about it now, but so you have the protests going up and all that kind of stuff in late '67, and then all of a sudden in February during the Lunar New Year, the Tet New Year, one of the biggest holiday in Vietnam. You have the VC and the NBA attacking in 100 different places, including the American embassy in Saigon. Now, so you have to think of all of that stuff that all the administration said, that we're winning and all this kind of stuff. And even though there was lots of doubts that and there's television reporting Vietnam every day, but basically the leader's saying we're winning. But then you have the Tet Offensive where they're attacking in 100 places. Then you have American cameras like the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite reporting on the scene that the Americans, for a little while, at least for a few hours, at least didn't have control of the American embassy in Saigon, which is kind of the symbol of America in the country. So you have, even though a week or two later, every single one of these attacks were beat back significantly. You have now a change in perception of the American people. They're like, oh, wait a minute. I thought we were winning this thing.
Thanks, Walter Cronkite.
Yeah, he was actually came in and
thank God.
He didn't, so you have...
That was before media was owned by the politicians.
Right. Well, it's an oversimplification, but basically saying when Cronkite actually came in and said this is a stalemate, so either we need to figure out a way to get out of here. Johnson realized, look, I've lost most of the country because Cronkite's the most trusted journalist in America. Mm-hmm. So anyway, you had that going on, and so that began the process of what was called Vietnamization. Johnson decided, okay, look, I'm not going to run for re-election. I'm going to concentrate on giving the fight back to the Vietnamese and taking American troops out. He didn't start wholesale doing it, but he said he was going to try to do this, and that's all try to negotiate a peace.
Had Fulbright already said you're wrong? Had he already turned on it?
Fulbright was holding Vietnam hearings in 1966.
So he had already begun.
Those two never talked.
He was trying to scream from the rooftops.
Those two never spoke again after that, and after 1966 for the most part. Johnson started calling him Senator Half-Bright instead of Senator Fulbright.
Clever.
Yeah. Anyway, so you have...
That's so 7th grade.
I know. It's quickest thing. It was probably the easiest thing to think of. Anyway, so you have, after that, from 68 through to 73, you have... Because when Nixon came in, although he had his own problems, it was Nixon, but his kind of idea was to very slowly de-escalate the war, taking more American troops out while trying to train the South Vietnamese.
Like we did in Iraq.
Yeah, basically taking more troops out, but also bombing the crap out of everybody and bombing the crap out of Cambodia and areas like that as well, because they were staging areas for the Ho Chi Minh Trail for the North Vietnamese coming to the south. So you have eventually very few troops in the 71, a lot fewer troops in 71, 72, and eventually them taking more and more people home, and eventually as they're negotiating the peace, which happens in, say, January of 1973. But that's when you have the significant increase in the amount of protests that were going on. You have Kent State in 1970. You have all these other things going on, and that damaged significantly Nixon's presidency so much that he started saying we need to find out about our enemies and we need to start wiretapping places.
So he once again went, oh crap, I better get to that fear thing again.
Yeah. Well, yeah. No, he was the one in the 69 was saying, and there's so much parallels to today, because like in 69, because there was all these protests against him, he made this big speech calling upon the great silent majority. Basically, all the people that don't usually speak out, all the people from the flyover states, well, that we call them now, that don't usually speak out. I want to hear your voices from the great silent majority. Against the only Americans can embarrass. Nobody else can embarrass Americans. Only we can do that. Is what he said. So basically, calling upon you're real Americans, as Sarah Palin might say. And it worked significantly because you have this lots of people saying they're going to support the president. Of course, that deteriorated as things got worse. And this is the same thing that Trump is doing now. I don't even know if he used silent majority, but he basically says, I am working for you. Let me help. And he's basically talking about a certain group of usually older, significantly as far as demographically, white, not significantly educated, but basically those people that seem to feel that they are not, their issues are not disenfranchised, their issues aren't being addressed.
Right.
So there's lots of parallels between Nixon and Trump. Paranoid, thin-skinned, authoritarian.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of that. Anyway, that's
It's also fascinating. Wait, so you teach at
LSU at the moment, Louisiana State University.
Louisiana State.
Yeah.
Okay. I would say go team person, but I don't know what the football mascot is.
Tigers is what
Go Tigers! There we go. See, I find it's really a shame. When I was in 9th grade and had to take civics and all that kind of stuff, I could care less back then.
Yeah.
But now, as I grew up and I realized that the world didn't revolve around me, which I think happens around 20-something, or maybe, I don't know. I think it changes.
In this town, it never happens.
We got a lot of musicians here.
The world does revolve around me.
Who's that Galileo guy? I love that band, the Galileos. Anyway, I find history fascinating. My biggest thing is I wish more people would read about our past because it's also our present. And I think that there's such this weird division of, that happened then and that's never going to happen again. And it happens over and over again. It never doesn't happen.
One of the best quotes from a historian is a guy named Howard Zinn. He basically said, if you do not read history, then basically the current politicians will get away with anything and everything.
Yeah.
Because then you won't know that there was a precedent of this happening. It's so interesting because Trump once again was talking about, it's not going to be an internationalist thing. His administration is not going to be an internationalist administration. It's going to be an Americanist administration. We're going to deal with America first. And him saying, as if he created this. Right before World War II, there was a fight between the internationalists and the isolationists, because they didn't want America to get involved in World War II. There was a committee called the America First Committee. People don't know this stuff, and they totally downplayed the Nazis and everything like that, and basically saying if Germany wins, it's not going to hurt. It's not going to hurt us. Basically thinking that because we are so far away from all these other places, that these other places don't matter.
Right. That is a sad thing. Americans have a real egocentric mentality, which is a shame.
And the point about it is, I understand it. Everybody's proud of where they're from.
Sure.
And that's things that Americans don't understand. Because and it happened back in Vietnam too. What the leaders back in Vietnam here assumed was that the people in South Vietnam wanted to be just like Americans. And so they came in with that attitude and were surprised when it wasn't that way.
It is the whole us and them mentality in general. And again, this is why I want to talk about stuff like this, because we, at the bottom line, is we are human beings. We are of the human kind. And it's so easy to that guy wears a green shirt and I wear a blue shirt. Right. So he's wrong, I'm right. Yeah. And that's the most simplified way to put it. But on a global scale, again, how we started this podcast, and I said, why do we care? I understand we didn't want Russia to drop bombs on us.
Yeah.
I get that. But why do we care what someone else's policy or religion or whatever is? Unless, of course, they're hurting mass people. I do believe that we as human beings, forget the America thing, I think human beings should go in and help the underdog.
Right.
Politics aside, there shouldn't be human trafficking. There shouldn't be mass genocide.
Right.
That's not okay.
Right.
I definitely stand for that. But I'm not really behind the whole thing that we should get to dictate how another person chooses to worship or love, or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's an oversimplification, but
I totally get where you're at, and it's just interesting because it would be interesting to me, to my mind, is if you strip away those people who are the loudest voices. Mm-hmm. Because once you strip away the people that are the loudest voices, there's a whole lot more tolerance than that.
I agree with you.
Because you have the voices, particularly on the right, but it's not just them, who are basically saying that America is a Christian nation, America is this or that, and all that kind of stuff, and trying to divide instead of actually having everyone come together. And most people, if we listen to all of those, if the Supreme Court listened to all those voices, then you wouldn't have gay marriage. Now you have gay marriage, and you have all these people yelling, but everybody is like, "What are you yelling about? Who?
Right?
It's not going on with you."
Well, I will. That's one thing over life that I have realized is the people that are yelling the loudest are the most offensive, and probably deep down know their argument isn't a sound one.
Right.
Otherwise, they wouldn't need to yell. They could have an actual discourse,
right?
An intellectual, not I'm not saying smart necessarily, but just a conversation. Yeah. There's no need to scream,
right?
And who's, like you said, the infomercial, the Democrats are about to start their infomercial, and who's to say they're not going to be just as full of lunacy as.
Oh, they're going to be.
They're lunatic on a different. They lunacy over one thing, and the Republicans lunacy over another, and it's maddening.
Usually, it is. There is a lot of wisdom in the fact that the truth lies somewhere near the middle. Yeah. It's not. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's just one way. Sometimes. Yeah. It's significantly one answer over another, but there is a lot of people that live either center right, center left, middle, somewhere. Most people politically, socially, whatever, are in this middle, this kind of live and let live thing. But you have the people screaming on either side, and it's really hard to let your voice be heard.
But my concern is the people in the middle are so overwhelmed by the screaming that they're not going to show up on election day. Yeah,
I think because I think this time it's not necessarily because of that. I think this time because it's a situation where you have two candidates who are hated so much.
They are.
And even the people that are going to be voting for Hillary don't particularly care for her all that much.
Well, I say that all the time. I said, look, as a human being, not a big fan, but I think for the job, if she were a man, here's the other thing. I hate to pull the female card, but if she were, a lot of the rhetoric I read online, it's like woman this, woman that. I think it's just like with President Obama, black.
Oh,
you wouldn't have a problem of her, ordering strikes if she had a penis.
Right.
It would be just a normal day in politics for somebody of that.
There's a lot
she was not the first person in the history of American politics to order that. Yeah, she won't be the last.
I think that's a part of it. I think there's certain people that would not vote for a female, and I understand that. But if that female was somebody like Elizabeth Dole or Sarah Palin, they probably would.
Yeah, I know. So it's bizarre.
So it is partly gender, and I that's obvious. I think the people that vote based on the rhetoric that's around them
instead of going
people that worry me. But it's just that's the way the system is. People.
Well, Brexit is a great example of that.
Yeah.
People didn't know what they were voting for. They just voted. And I read an article about Google saying the next day the the search engines were off the charts for what it was.
Right.
So basically they voted and then they went and tried to figure out what it was when
Right.
they realized their vote created this havoc.
Right.
Yes.
Right. I mean, that is kind of the getting back to the whole point of having an informed electorate. There's certain,
The founding fathers are just getting drunk as shit right now and going, what has happened? They're having rolling in grave contests.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's significantly difficult. I mean, but what's interesting is stuff like the play Hamilton.
Yeah.
It just even peripherally deals with, say, the election of 1800, when they were talking about all this crap on either side. I mean, it's always been.
I know. Oh,
it's always been, and it's always been, it's always been the mud being thrown on either side. It's just getting more. It's because we have 24/7 everything.
Oh, I know. Because everything is accessible. And politicians have always preyed on the people who are most easily lemminged out. The ones that won't go research the facts, the ones that won't. They just spoon feed them information. They eat it, and then they start spewing it out because it's so much easier than to think for oneself. And I have to remember, when I start getting frustrated by it, I have to remember that we're young. We're a young country.
Yeah.
We're a young species, and I just, waiting for that day when Will Smith comes on the TV and says, I'm here to talk about the alien invasion. And then suddenly the world will be unified.
And it's funny, there's a British comedian, Bill Bailey, and he says, I am a relaxed empiricist. He said, okay, I'll tell you what it means. He said, he basically said, an empiricist is somebody who wants to know the truth, who wants to get to the. This is his definition. Wants to get to the truth of things. Because I'm a relaxed empiricist in that you certainly want the truth, but I'm just going to basically believe if somebody I really know tells me what it is, I'm not going to go look it up.
Yes, exactly.
And we have a nation of relaxed empiricists.
Yeah. And, some aren't even that concerned about the truth. Let's be honest.
Yeah. Well, you choose the own truth that you know. Because basically, if the actual truth goes against your thoughts or the way you've thought all the time, then you reject it.
Yes.
You can talk about that with regards to science. Yeah. You can talk about that with regards to race or anything
religion,
else.
Anything.
So it's like basically if it goes against your beliefs, then you reject it, even though there is irrefutable evidence.
I actually enjoy talking to people that don't have the same belief system as me because I learn a lot, first of all, and it's generally a pretty good conversation because the people tend to not scream, which I enjoy, the not screaming people. And I think it's important to know what the opposite thought thinks.
Yeah.
And who knows, maybe the opposite thought from me might say something and I'll go think about it myself for a while and decide that thought was actually a pretty good thought.
Yeah.
Growth, there's nothing wrong with growth. I don't know why people are so
People are very
set.
scared. People are very scared.
Yeah.
And you see, it's easier, I mean, as you know, it's easier to think of something like, okay, why is my situation not great right now?
It's their fault.
I remember it's their fault, but I remember my mom and dad's situation was fantastic, and I'm struggling here. So why don't we do something to get back to make America great again? The whole point about it is that the Daily Show did a great thing when they interviewed people from the Republican convention, and they asked them, and this is what they should ask Trump right now: when was America great? And some of them are saying, oh, well, it was great in 1776 when we decided that we were going to fight, or when we created a new government and all that kind of stuff. And then the person interviewed was like, oh, except for slavery. Oh, wait, except for slavery. Oh, except for this. Oh, except for that.
Sure.
Because in every situation, in every era, there was a situation where people weren't all feeling so great or weren't having it so great. And if you go anywhere before, say, 1970, you have, for African Americans, you have significantly difficult situations.
Absolutely. I did a podcast with Ruby Amanfu, and who's African American. Literally, she's from Ghana, and
Okay.
she's now, she's
Okay.
become a citizen. Anyway, we were talking about when was, the ideal time that everyone keeps talking about, and I said, well, I think for white people, I think it's the 50s, but certainly not for anyone of color, certainly not for, we had Japanese internment camps in America. We have had a problem with, the housewives that were supposed to be all smiles taking pills like they were going out of style. We had corruption in politics. It's... When has it ever been? And that's not to be such a Debbie Downer, but it's just that's reality. And to use that as a manipulative tool.
Well, it's what he's saying is not so far removed from, say, George Wallace in the early 70s, 60s, and stuff like that. Segregationist, governor of Alabama, ran for president in '68, got 19% of the vote. Basically,
that seems real high.
From the America Party. The America Party. I mean, he was basically saying, let's and Reagan too. Reagan was talking about, basically going back to having people proud of America again instead of hostages in Iraq, and people saying that America wasn't strong anymore. Like going back to the time when America was strong. I even remember during a debate between Jimmy Carter and Reagan, basically they were talking about race somewhere, and he goes, well, it was different back in the 50s when there wasn't a race problem.
That's brilliant. Terrifying.
When there wasn't a race problem. And it's like,
are you
well,
kidding
there
me?
wasn't a race problem for you because they were just serving you drinks on the golf course.
Exactly.
Or whatever. So Make America Great Again is so much of a code for let's make America
white again.
Or let's make America great again so that white people can get more than the perceived number of minorities that are just going for the public money. That kind of thing. There's all this kind of.
I know.
It's all tied up into that. It's all very much tied into that, and that's going to be the problem for Trump, because, like I say, in places like Pennsylvania, he has 0% of the African American vote, and I would think that you would need at least some percentage of the African American vote to win that state, and he probably has a small percentage of Hispanic vote as well. So it's just like it's going to be close, but without those two demographics, that's the problem with the Republican Party. I mean, the Republican Party is seemingly on the death throes right now.
I know. It is.
And
I read some comedian on Twitter said they felt like America is about to jump the shark.
Jump the shark. Oh, I love it.
I know. So funny.
I mean, no, it's...
I could talk about this stuff
Yeah.
forever and ever. I think it's so fascinating. I see that at the end of every podcast. It seems like the listeners are probably like, enough already. What would be a great book that you could recommend for people who want to know more about this time frame, and maybe even how it correlates to now? Maybe a couple books that wouldn't be highbrow,
If you want just your basic history, and it's really, really well done, and it's 200 or 300 pages or something like that. George Herring's America's Longest War is kind of it's the textbook, but it's very readable, and it's something that you can get, and it goes chronologically, and you can find it. But one of the best books, and I don't remember the author's name, but it's a big book, but it's not a book that you have to read all of it. You can read little bits of it. It's called Patriots.
Yeah. We could Google it. I'll look it up and put it on my website for you guys.
It's a huge oral history of Vietnam. So you have anywhere from...
It's a written oral history, or is he talking?
No, he's not talking.
It's a tape.
It's basically he interviewed thousands of people, from political leaders, to people in the military, everywhere. Like not only the VC, the NBA, the generals, the Americans, people who were still suffering from effects of PTSD and all this kind of stuff, protesters. They even interviewed one of the former Playboy bunnies who went on one of the USO tours with Bob Hope. I mean, it's and John McCain and various and sundry others. But it's a big book, but it's one of those things you read a few of them and you get a flavor of what it was like.
Was the bunnies interview over 2 pages with a staple in the middle?
I just read the article.
Yes.
I don't know anything about it. But no, to me it is the best book on if you really want to get to beyond the story, because you can always read a chronology of what was going on
to get into the heads of everyone.
That was doing
which
it,
I think is brilliant.
And you have, once again, it's one of those things that you don't have to sit there and read it all in one sitting. You can read a few of these little oral histories and it'll give you a little flavor, and as you go along you get a fuller picture of what it was like for those people that were there. And I think and I think that what was interesting is I think the author is Scandinavian. He's not American. He's not Vietnamese.
Sure.
So he kind of comes at it from a neutral angle, which is actually pretty good.
Awesome. All right, I'll post those on the Human website. Thank you, Mark, for being here.
Thank you, Susan.
And by the way, Mark is also a musician. Do you have a website for that too? A performing professor. How cool is that?
Well, a lot of the demos that I have are on SoundCloud.com/Mark-Carson.
There you go. All right. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Yay.